Welcome to the Pacesetter Pod, where we explore and reveal the perspectives, insights, and approaches to deliver great results and growth in your agribusiness through better execution. Here's your host, the Integration Pacesetter, Joe Mosier.
Welcome, Pacesetters of Agribusiness, to another episode of the Pacesetter Pod, where we amplify voices from across the industry, aggregate those perspectives, and elevate our collective thinking around strategy execution. I'm your host, Joe Mosier, and I appreciate you choosing to spend your time with us today. Before we get into today's episode, a very quick reminder to like and subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. You can do it right now. It's the best way to ensure that you never miss an episode. And if you're so inclined, we'd love it if you consider leaving us a review to let us know how we're doing. You know, agribusinesses operate along complex supply chains. And when you come into the industry, if you think back to your internship, your co-op, your first years of your career, it's often where we spend a lot of time, right? Not just understanding the company and our job, but the supply chain in which it competes and operates. And that's done because it helps provide context to the organization and gives some visibility to the upstream and the downstream activities that bookend the leg or position of the supply chain that you occupy. Now, the best agribusiness operators that I've interacted with also go on to develop a deep understanding of the supply chain end to end, not limited just to the boundary conditions of where they play and compete. And this is both to help them effectively play their role, but it also helps them identify opportunities for efficiency and growth. And it also helps them anticipate disruptions that are likely or probable and be ready to adapt to them. Because when you operate in a complex supply chain, there's a lot of things outside of your control. What's always in your control is your ability to plan and be ready. That said, I think most of us can continually do a better job of developing this intimate understanding of our supply chains. You know, spending the time to pull them apart to their component pieces, to understand why each piece exists, revisiting if they're operating in the most efficient and additive manner possible, thinking of unmet needs that exist, and ultimately looking for ways to improve outcomes for our customers and better results for our companies. And so today it's an absolute pleasure to share a conversation I had with Scott Walker of KSW Global and Verse Chocolate. Scott's a veteran of the cocoa and chocolate business, primarily in ADM. Later, he worked in the pet food industry before ultimately returning to the cocoa and chocolate industry, where he spent nearly 2 decades and ultimately launching the 2 companies that he leads. Now, before some of you think about maybe skipping this one, as it does not fit into our more common mold of a traditional agribusiness and seed or grain, agronomy, feed, retail, processing, or otherwise, I encourage you to stick with it and tune in. Scott's very passionate about what he does. He's incredibly knowledgeable about the space in which he operates. And I think his lessons and journey offer some really insightful parallels to the organizations and types of businesses that you all operate. So I thank you as always for tuning into the Pacesetter Pod today. And with that, here's my conversation with Scott Walker of KSW Global and Verse Chocolate. Scott Walker, welcome to the Pacesetter Pod.
Hey, thank you, Joe. Good to be on here. I appreciate the invite.
Yeah, well, I'm looking forward to the conversation and some of the unique perspectives and some of the experiences you've had within agribusiness outside of the typical commodity and business profile that we talk about. We haven't had someone on in the cocoa space before. And with that, before we start talking about some of the things that we want to get into today, Scott, you run two different businesses right now that you've founded and started up, KSW and Verse Chocolate. For our listeners' benefit, because I think it'll help set the stage for all the topics we dig into after this, give us a brief overview of each of those businesses, how they came about, and what you're seeking to achieve or deliver through each one of those entities.
Okay, great. I'll start with KSW. KSW is it's really like a cocoa commodity trading business. I was with ADM, Archer Daniels Midland, for many years and in the cocoa business with them after growing up on a grain farm to connect with the listeners who might be in agribusiness. And ADM moved me around trading commodities and then eventually into the cocoa world. And so I lived 12 years in Europe trading cocoa. And we had cocoa processing plants all over Europe, Africa, West Africa, primarily Asia, South America, North America. And when ADM sold those businesses they sold the chocolate business to Cargill, the cocoa business to Olam, I moved back to the United States from Switzerland and went into the pet food industry for a little while. And after a few years of that, I decided to start Verse Chocolate. And out of Verse Chocolate, actually KSW started. And KSW was really this helping West Africa, helping local processors in West Africa process locally, and they would make products that go into the chocolate world, and they didn't have a way to connect to chocolate makers. And think of all the brands that you know, and my name came up, and they're like, hey, Scott used to be the president of ADM Cocoa and the chairman of the European Cocoa Association. He has all these connections. Maybe he can help us make those connections. So I did my diligence along with my partner. His name's Mohamedou Khan at the time, and he's still my partner. He's the one that made the call to me, and he's in West Africa. And he said, Scott, can you help me help these local players? And so we did our diligence with the local players and said, okay, I think we can help you. Because in this business, like anybody's business, sure, there's risk in commodities and hedging, and we do all that, but it's really the counterparty risk. And so it was, we have a counterparty that's going to take cocoa beans locally, process them into the ingredients for chocolate, which is literally, it's just called the cocoa liquor. That's the trade name. Nothing to do with alcohol, but cocoa liquor, cocoa butter, and then cocoa powder. And I can open doors for many people in the world, actually, not just Europe and North America, who use those things, but they're only going to buy them from people they trust and can deliver and they have confidence in. So really, KSW is, we're the commercial arm. We're that link between an origin, what we call it, a factory in the Ivory Coast or Cameroon in West Africa, that is taking that bean, processing it further, creating value locally, and then selling it into the world market. And so we create that trust and confidence for that local player and interacts with that maybe global chocolate maker or a regional chocolate maker for them to be able to feel comfortable with, we're going to deliver, because we take ownership, we deliver it to them and make sure that they get the right product, the right quality, and on the right time at the right price. It's the price they agreed to. That's really what KSW is.
So that's interesting. I don't know the chocolate and the cocoa business intimately. Had some exposure to it in my time at Cargill, primarily in South America. But am I right then in believing that the majority, if not all of that initial value-added processing historically has not occurred at point of origin, that processing has occurred elsewhere, which means the value in the processing has accrued to legs of the supply chain, not close to the point of origin where the actual cocoa farmers are producing and aggregating the production?
Yeah. That's correct. That's good. That's good that you recognize that. So 70% of all the cocoa in the world today, or has been historically for the last 20 years, has been produced in West Africa, Ivory Coast, Ghana, and Nigeria, and Cameroon, those 4 countries specifically. And yes, most of that cocoa has been exported and shipped to Europe, Asia, North America. And then that's where the first stage of processing has been. And so that value has been captured outside of those origins. And our goal is to really, let's capture that value there. Let's create jobs at origin, because that has such great influence on those countries. And when I got into the cocoa industry, it was the late 90s, but shortly after I got into the cocoa industry, the issues of child labor started coming up. And people were like, what do you do about child labor? And, that's a very extensive issue. And, we don't have time to get into that here. In fact, it would take multiple podcasts to really deal with that issue. But, one of the things you can do is, well, let's create jobs there. Just as you and I talked about, I grew up on a farm. And, I'm not still working on that farm because there's many opportunities in the United States to go and work somewhere else. Well, let's create those opportunities at origin where parents want their kids to get educated because there's opportunities for them outside of just being on the farm. And so, yes, so we are creating value, and that's what we can do to help bring that. It's really bringing that trust and confidence and bridging that gap between what the Western world, if you will, the final users, and what they are used to and who do they know to deal with to be able to make sure. Because, we're 5,000 miles away, 7,000 miles away, 8,000 miles away. It's hard to get to these places. Can you really trust that the quality is going to be there? I mean, this is going right into the food chain. And that's completely changed over the years. And that's really remarkable how well, in fact, many of these factories now in West Africa are nicer than European or North America or U.S. factories. They're so well done.
You said something interesting there, Scott, and I do want to, we'll move beyond the business breakdowns, but I think this is really important. So yes, you do have the geographic sort of separation from point of origin to the point of processing and consumption in these markets. And so yes, that always requires a high degree of trust in your counterparty. And that's where a lot of the risks is. But you had said, by being almost the commercial link between those ultimate consumptive end users and the points of origin with some value-added processing, you're the commercial link, you're kind of the face of it, and you're helping to bridge the trust and confidence, as you put it. And so my question was going to be, why have we not historically invested in processing infrastructure at point of origin? And I was wondering, was it just lack of imagination? But I think what you're pointing to is actually it was perhaps lack of investment appetite based on the lack of trust in quality or consistency, or I'm sure there's a lot there to unpack, but that you think trust and confidence has been one of the biggest barriers to this happening prior to you guys doing it?
Yeah, well, I think that, historically in Europe, chocolate factories were, built, families built them, and then they would basically get gobbled up by the big brands, and they still use those chocolate factories. Well, so these were factories that were built maybe in the early 1900s, mid 1900s, and once you build that land and you have that piece of land and you have that equipment, they'll last a long time. And so it wasn't really until the 80s that you saw expansion into West Africa, but it took a long time. And there was political unrest. Can I really, trust that, my investment's going to be okay? And so, I mean, even though there was, these were former colonies of either Cote d'Ivoire or Belgium or Germany, or depending on where you're at, or the UK, there was still just concern about that. So many investors at the time were like, no, I don't want to put my money there for that further processing. Plus these are food items, right? You need to be confident. It's going into the food chain. You need to be confident. And there wasn't a lot of education on food safety, on quality, on even engineering. But really, and if I think about Cote d'Ivoire, really in the 80s and 90s, and 2000s, but they started really upping their game on those particular issues. So now, if you go to West Africa today, I promise you, there are more engineers, food technologists, quality people in West Africa for food than there probably are in maybe even Europe and specifically the cocoa and chocolate, because they have grown that. I mean, it's really changed. So now the software, if you will, of the versus just the hardware and the equipment is there. And the locals really understand how to make a top quality, consistently top quality item, product that can go right into the food chain. And that's really, I would say that's only been real correct. The big players, again, ADM, Cargill, Barry Callebaut, some of them, they've been able to do that and they've done that. But now it's been others can do that. And that's kind of the big change. That's the big tide change.
Well, that's exciting, and I think kudos to you for looking to put your fingerprints on the future of the industry and perhaps change where some of that value accrues. Because there's some of these dynamics exist in multiple different commodity supply chains, and I think this is an interesting use case for that. So maybe tell us for just a moment then also about the original business that led to KSW, Verse Chocolate.
Verse Chocolate. Well, thanks. So, Verse Chocolate, it's a branded chocolate. We make a chocolate that goes on the shelf, and we're not in that many locations. We're only in like 400 stores in the United States, but primarily we're in a lot of Whole Foods. I'm in the Midwest, Florida, California, Texas, but not in every Whole Foods, and then some smaller mom and pop like natural stores. The focus of Verse Chocolate really was, I said I was with ADM. I was president of the global cocoa and chocolate business, sold it, and I moved to Missouri, where I live now, to be the CEO of a pet food company. And it was still supply chain type stuff. And what I learned there in the pet food side is that this is 11 years ago that I moved there, people really cared about the supply chain and the ingredients in pet food. And I was like, wow, that seems kind of crazy to me. And after 3 years of being there, I was like, and I'd left, I was like, well, okay, I'm going to go back to cocoa and chocolate. That's what I know best. I have all these connections outside of North America, but I'm like, I think I can make my own. So I had this crazy idea. Hey, I know the supply chain. I understand that people care about the ingredients of pet food. Why don't they care that much about the ingredients of cocoa? I'm going to make my own chocolate. And we're going to really focus on the transparency and where the cocoa is coming from. And we're going to put it on the shelf, thinking really that would be easy. And then as I was working through that and telling people my story, They're like, oh, you're singing a new song, you're singing a new tune about cocoa and chocolate, you're singing a new verse about cocoa and chocolate. And that's where the name Verse Chocolate came from, is like, hey, here I came from running this very big, large B2B industrial chocolate cocoa maker to First Chocolate. And this dream, if you will, of, hey, cocoa is good for you. I want people to eat more cocoa, but I don't want to put as much sugar around it as everybody else or as much milk powder around it. So we're going to sing a new tune. We're going to focus on the fermentation of the cocoa bean. And when we control the fermentation of the cocoa bean and we do that well, the quality of the bean is so good. The quality, the taste is so good that you don't need to process it just like everybody else processes their chocolate. And really, you get a better flavor. You get a creamier flavor. So we make only dark chocolate, a 90% dark and a 70% dark chocolate, but it doesn't taste as dry or as brittle, or it just tastes creamier than other 90s and 70s because of how we ferment the cocoa. So that's Verse Chocolate. And that's, and as I was starting that is when I got the call that we could help out these origin processors. And that's what started KSW out of that. So I kind of started them about the same time, and they kind of both, I made my first sales for both of them, the first like actual dollars during COVID in 2020. So if you think about that, I started up two companies like within months of each other. We got the first sales, and it's kind of crazy, that looking back, but we were just focused in on this is what we need to do.
Well, I think, so we're going to talk about what is the experience of building a CPG brand when you're more of a commodity background, and how easy and what a glide path that I'm sure that all is. But I think it's interesting to have your finger in kind of two different, not just two, but to be operating in two different roles in that supply chain probably gives you a lot of that immediate market feedback that's additive to both ends of the equation. And so while I imagine the day-to-day, what do I focus on? What do I prioritize? Wait, which business am I working for right now? I'm sure that's all a challenge to keep straight. I think probably those shortened feedback loops are highly additive.
They are, and they are complementary, but they're completely different businesses. I mean, the KSW side is really, it's a commodity. You really have like one or two suppliers, and we have like really, I'm going to say 12 to 14 customers, and that's it. And it's about relationships. And you may talk to that same supplier and those same customers for 6, 8, 10 months before you actually make a sale. But once you make the sale or make the trade, it could be for the next 6 months or 12 months even, right? And it could be very large when you do that. Whereas Verse, the supply chain matters, everything I just talked about, but I don't know my customers. I mean, unless it's like you, I know you're a customer of mine, or somebody like that, I, meet on the street says, oh, I like Verse Chocolate, but I've got thousands and tens of thousands of customers that I'll never know. And that's just a completely different business model. And I'm a relationship guy. And you sit there and say, well, okay, what do I have to do? Well, then I just got to make sure on the CPG side or on the Verse Chocolate side, that, okay, we got to make a great product. We got to be able to price it correct. There's got to be margin in it, and we got to be consistent in our quality. And then what's our differentiate? Why are we different? And then that's where you start to think, well, that's every business, but oh wow, I've never done a product on a shelf. Then you start asking yourself, what have I gotten myself into? But that's all another topic. So.
And yes, and to our listeners, my household is now a customer of Verse Chocolate. Scott's customer acquisition cost was limited to sending us just a bag of the peanut butter cups, and kids are hooked. So we'll be looking for the closest place we can re-up on our next supply after the holidays. But let's talk about supply chain, Scott, more directly, specifically the value of supply chain intimacy. So obviously the cocoa supply chain is different from corn and beans and soy, pulses, wheat, a lot of things that we typically talk about in this program. But at the end of the day, knowing the supply chain end to end and not just the leg that you compete in is really important. And I think you've highlighted that here already in the story. A couple of examples. One, it'll help you see where value is currently accruing and where maybe you could do something different to improve that chain and reallocate some of the value, or perhaps participate and have higher participation in the margin capture, right? Yeah. And two, it also helps you know where there's inefficiencies or unmet needs. So I don't think you can really overstate end-to-end supply chain knowledge and intimacy. That's my personal perspective. You've talked about your knowledge of the supply chain and some of the players, and you talked about even identifying again, where processing is built and the role of fermentation and creating a better health profile, more delicious chocolate product. But those and maybe even beyond, talk to us about, how do you look at your knowledge of your supply chain in helping you suss out the gaps and the opportunities and then build a strategy around it? Because
Okay.
I'm guessing that there's some philosophical takeaways there that our listeners should think about and say, look, if I stop thinking about my business and I start thinking about my supply chain, something new may emerge that I can go after.
Well, that's a great question. And there's a lot there. So you can cut me off here. But first of all, I've been to West Africa since 1999. It was the first time I went to West Africa. I've been to West Africa, those 4 countries I mentioned earlier, somewhere between 107 and 112 times. So I'd say first is you got to be intimate. Like you've got to go and know it. You've got to go and see, the different aspects and understand why this may or may not be the same. And you think you may know it all, but you don't actually. You never know it all. But some of the things are always the same, but you can always learn it. But one of the things, so I was in ADM cocoa. I was in the cocoa business for 16 years for ADM. I was with ADM 21 years. So 16 years I'm in cocoa. I went in 98. First time to Africa is 99. And I'm learning a ton about, in ADM, we did big volumes, lots of volumes. And you bought cocoa, you bought commodity cocoa. Okay. And this is where I think this is quite interesting. In commodity, there's a term, a specification, kind of like number 2 yellow corn. In cocoa, it's called fair average quality, FAQ, fair average quality. And that has to do with the fermentation. That has to do with, how much waste is in there. And, there's a spec. So when you process, hundreds of thousands of tons of cocoa a year, you just bought fair average quality and you were trying to buy the cheapest cocoa you could to make it into, really the cheapest product you could make that, satisfied your customers, right? And so that was what I knew. That's what we did, and we focused on the dollars and cents, which is what you do. So after I guess I leave there, and I was also chairman of the European Cocoa Association. So I sat around the table with all the big players and all the big chocolate makers, and we talked about cocoa day and night. I mean, for 16 years, I spent a lot of time. And I was 2 years in Brazil on cocoa. So just a lot of time on cocoa. I leave, I go do pet food. The only time I think about chocolate then is when I'm at a restaurant and I want to order dessert. I don't think about it for 3 years in cocoa. And when I come back in, I'm like, okay, what could be different? I know a lot about cocoa. I know a lot about the supply chain. I literally got on a plane within a few weeks of leaving the pet food industry and went back to Nigeria and started spending time. I took 47 bags of cocoa from 47 different farms in Nigeria, put them through the same process at my house. And I realized they all tasted different. And I was like, how could that be? How can they all taste different? And then I was very curious to me. I'm like, well, wait, if they all taste different, that's not what I would have thought in the big commodity industry. So all Nigerian cocoa tastes like this. All Ghana cocoa tastes like this. All Ivory Coast tastes like this. And I was like, what? Why do these 47 individual farms taste differently? I'm like, I learned something. So I started digging into why is that? And that led me down a path of many things. And what I started hearing was the way the cocoa is fermented on each farm is not going to be consistently the same. And some's going to do it this way, some that way. Okay, yes, the soil does make some difference, but really the fermentation was going to make the biggest difference. And that led me down this whole path. And this is what's so interesting to me. So I called one of my former head of quality at ADM. He was here in North America. And I said, hey, Mr. Head of Quality, we did a project at ADM where we focused on the fermentation of cocoa and we controlled the fermentation. I go, was that work? Was that good? I mean, I don't remember the results. And I remember him saying immediately, oh, no, that didn't work. That was a waste of time. And I'm like, what? And he goes, Scott, the quality of the cocoa liquor, the number one product we get out of that, was so good that we didn't need as much sugar. And sugar is the cheapest thing you can put in chocolate. So actually, the more sugar you can put into it, everybody's happier. He goes, we didn't need as much sugar. And I was like, oh my, it's the inverse. Yes, it does work. And that's what I was looking for. And it's just interesting that you spend 16 years in an industry, you think you know exactly, okay, here's the supply chain, this is what works. But when you start asking questions and you dig deeper and you go to a level that you've never done before, you're like, oh, there are things happening that I never realized. It was all getting blended up. I mean, that's what was happening. Those 47 farms were getting blended, in the big commodity world, and it was just all one flavor. Fine. But then you realize, oh no, let's look deeper. And then you realize, wow, if I control the fermentation, and I can get those all actually consistent to taste the same now. And the taste is so much different. So I was like, wow, that was a big aha moment for me to understand the supply chain and how I can differentiate in chocolate versus chocolate. And the other thing, and I want to jump in here, I went to other colleagues of mine who were still in the industry, important players who've been in this for 30, 35 years at the time. And I asked them about this, and to a person that all said it, that was stupid. I shouldn't even think about that. There was no money in that. Nobody would ever pay for a controlled fermented cocoa bean. And I thought, the masses are asses.
Poorly executed mergers and acquisitions destroy more value than they create. They can set your company back years. To defend your firm's position in the marketplace, you need access to the leading practices that unlock the greater potential of your people, processes, and systems. If you are undertaking a company transformation or pursuing an acquisition as a vehicle to grow, set up a call with Joe by visiting www.moshercg.com.
So the hubris to kind of jump back into the industry, if you will, based on I've been doing this for so long, I spent so much time in the field, I know the players, etc. And then to balance that sort of, maybe hubris is the wrong word, just the really deep held confidence that I can get back into this, I'm going to do something. And then also maintaining the curiosity to say, okay, let's revisit our priors. And there's a couple of, I hesitate to ever talk about first principles because I think it's a widely overused term and people don't often know what they're talking about here. But the first principles, as I understand it, is, getting something down to its most basic, true component elements.
Yeah.
And in this case, you're saying, okay, let's look at, okay, what is coming off of the farm? You had these 47 samples. They all had a different taste profile, a different functional profile, et cetera. Okay. So based on a down to a particular acreage, we're likely to see different qualities. Okay. Yeah. So that's interesting. So that's actually something that is true that gets hidden by a supply chain built around the commoditization of the product. Yeah. Now, what is that supply chain? Why is it commoditizing the product? Because it's trying to produce a certain outcome of the cheapest, sweet, shelf-stable, familiar profile of chocolate for the masses, as you said, right? And there's some variation between different products you see on the shelf, but largely it's feeding one supply chain. We say, okay, well, what if there's a different need? So what if, as you said way back at the start of the show, what if folks actually want a creamier, richer, lower sugar and milk content product that has different sort of mouthfeel and texture characteristics? So it's revisiting your priors, but it's all built on that curiosity. If you hadn't known that the supply chain was looking to commoditize the product, you wouldn't have thought, that's curious. All these things taste different. If you hadn't known the supply chain's designed to produce a single type of finished good, you wouldn't have thought, wait a minute, let me ask some questions to see if we can get to a better outcome within that. And so, I just think that's a fascinating sort of example of, and I guess the other question I have here is, was that curiosity and that sort of fact-finding mission and pulling apart your priors, I mean, let's be honest, was that intentional or was that happenstance and you kind of stumbled into it because you're in this moment of professional transition and, kind of where did that come from? Or is that how you've always operated?
Oh, no, I don't think that's how I've always operated. I think it was, I kept thinking, hey, I can make a chocolate bar. And I talked to, there was a, bean to bar movement craze back in the early 2000s, really to kind of offset the whole child labor issue. I mean, that's a whole nother topic in and of itself. And so I flew around the country and talked to many people in the United States who do bean to bar, and they're all, small and trying to, and I was just trying to understand, okay, can I make my own chocolate? And I was trying to understand, and each one of them said it starts with a bean. They kept saying it starts with the bean. And I'm like, okay. And none of them were maybe a couple used Ghana, which was the second largest supplier, but nobody used the Ivory Coast and nobody used Nigeria and nobody used Cameroon. So I'm like, wait a minute, there's 3 of the 4 largest suppliers, these bean to bar guys, are not using it. I'm like, why is it? And they say, it's because of the flavor. And I'm like, okay, the flavor, that was number one, but it's also difficult to work into these West African countries too. So that was another big reason. And so as I was just trying to understand, like, okay, well, how do you scale this? And I guess I will say, I always think big. I just think we can do big things. And I was like, well, okay, I don't want to just, make chocolate for a certain region or make chocolate. I'm like, I want to do this and do it right. And I want to compete someday. It's going to be 30 or 40. I'll be dead, but there'll be, how do we, make something now that in 30, 40, 50 years is competing because we've done it right. We set those principles, but I'm like, okay, I need to make sure I don't need it to scale right now. And there'll be certain things that can't scale, but I need to understand, okay, I know from the supply chain, there are a better way to do these things than what they're telling me, but they don't know that. I have these bean to bar people that I'm meeting, and I'm like, well, they don't know what I know, and they could be more efficient. So how do I go to the most efficient source and do what they're doing, but do it in the most efficient way? And to me, that's why I just kept saying, well, when you know the supply chain like that, all of a sudden you see opportunity, and that's where you just see opportunity. Like, wait a minute. Like, give you an instance. At ADM, we made chocolate. So again, this is when the cocoa market was. This was the 2010s to 2014. So 15 years ago, approximately. You would make chocolate, or call it $1 to $2 a pound. Okay, and I'm now, whatever this was 7 years ago, I started getting into this, and I'm talking to these bean to bar guys, and they're making chocolate like at $16 to $20 a pound. And that's like their cost. And I'm like, wait a minute. And they think there's no way they could ever get below like $12 a pound. Yeah. And I'm like, they just think that's just crazy. You couldn't go down that much. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. You absolutely can. And then after I was like, wait, I can go pay the farmer a good premium for making a product that I can use, a good premium that's above the market. And percentage wise, that doesn't even really matter to a point. And I can go, if I can make a chocolate and put it on the shelf, I can make a much better product. And I understand the supply chain, like there's a lot of room in here to be able to figure this out. And so I guess that's where the curiosity really okay, well, what do I have to do to the bean to make it taste better from these origins? Because nobody's using these origins for this particular product. And then if I can do that, can I scale it to something that's much bigger, where I can maybe I'm not going to be $2 a pound, but can I do it at $4 a pound? And then I'm like, well, yeah, I think I can. And so that was it was that curiosity. And so I kind of early on thought, well, here's one side of the market, and here's what I know from my knowledge of the supply chain on the other side of the market. I don't know the CPG world, and I don't understand marketing, and that is a whole thing in and of itself. But I was like, there's a spread that's quite large, and I think I can figure that out. So my curiosity, I guess, back to like, you just see like, wow, there's an opportunity here that's quite large. How do I get in there?
Well, and I think the lesson or the takeaway I would highlight for our listeners is it may be innate in some people, but if we look at, even if you're not in a processing supply chain or you don't participate close to the processing, the idea of buying grain, fob the farm, and arranging your own freight, that was a process innovation at some point, right? Buying things on a flex program where you're going to contract delivery to our elevator, but we're going to give you the opportunity to deliver to 3 different destinations at the time that you fulfill that contract. That was an innovation born of an inefficiency in the supply chain. I just think it's really important for folks to say, we need to step back and look and say, where is there pain or friction, or where's there missed opportunities and inefficiencies? And maybe why does that exist and what can we do? Because if you know the supply chain well, again, I think you're just well positioned to go after it. One more question on supply chain before I want to make sure we do have time to talk about CPG, Scott. Beyond just creating a business, scaling a business, finding value, I would also expect supply chain competence and intimacy to also be a de-risking mechanism. And so if we look over the last 5 years, but as we look over the entire life cycle of your businesses, of both Verts and KSW, which have existed in a time of, let's say, some significant volatility. We have COVID and the lockdowns, container and vessel rates and freight availability and all its different modes. You have disease pressure like witch's broom and a variety of other things on cocoa production. And then, recently the tariffs and trade tensions, et cetera. Have you seen also that knowing your supply chain helps to sort of position you to weather those things better than you might otherwise, or even maybe see around corners and not overreact? I mean, does it actually have a de-risking mechanism as well beyond just building the business, but also maybe defending and sustaining the business?
Sure. I think of lots of things right off the bat, but I guess if you know your supply chain and you're a commodity person, you know the old adage, high prices cure high prices, low prices cure low prices. So when things are going crazy and you know your supply chain, you can be pretty confident that these crazy things aren't going to last forever. These are, things will go back to kind of like, supply and demand matter. Supply and demand matter. And that drives prices. And when you know those things and you know your market and you're like, okay, this won't be like, now you may set a new level, when I was growing up, corn was $1, I think it got down to $1.10 a bushel in like 1981 or 1982. And then, whatever, I don't follow it like I used to, but I know wherever it is today, at $3 a bushel or $4 a bushel or $5, that's become like the new norm, right? Fine. Those things will happen. But all of a sudden, like when it went to $8 a bushel, well, how long is it going to stay here? Well, it's not going to stay there forever. There's going to be impact. So when you really know your supply chain, you're confident in those things. Number one, you're like, okay, I feel good about that. But then when the things around that freight goes crazy, you're like, oh my goodness, what's this? Is that okay? You got to deal with it for whatever it is. You got to deal with it for a month. You got to deal with it for 6 months. But you learn to you don't panic. Or as an old colleague of mine used to say, panic slowly. When you know your supply chain and you can kind of like, yeah, okay, I know this will come back. I know this won't be a big issue. And I will say on the CPG side, I got a guy who's a marketer, like a classically trained marketing person for, brands. And he's been on my team for about 18 months. And whenever the cocoa supply chain was going crazy. So like last year, a year ago, like right now, we were at the all-time high for cocoa. We're almost half that price right now. But ever in the life of cocoa, we were at an all-time high. And he was like, my goodness, do you have enough coverage on? Do you have enough cocoa bought for the chocolate for our, and I'm like, we're okay. And I didn't panic. And kind of as you could feel the peak, it's interesting. I told him I put on a hedge. And he goes, you put on a, he didn't have any idea what I was talking about. And he didn't understand it. But I was like, and just you get a feel for the markets. And I put on a hedge against what was going on. And he was like, and once I explained it to him, he still didn't really understand it. But he knew I knew what I was doing, and he just calmed down. And so the point is that you give confidence to other people when you know your supply chain, because really that's a big risk. And if you can it's clearly a big risk. And when you know what drives those movements, you're like, oh. And if you don't know, then you jump in quickly to understand what is this, what is that, and you just know that's either okay, that'll go away, or that is the thing to focus on.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the things you just said kind of remind me of a common adage, if you will, or a phrase. And, when you're faced with the unknown, people tend to get scared, right? Or have fear. And when you have fear, you never make the optimal decision. And so what should you do? Try to control how many unknowns you're exposed to in those times of volatility. That's maybe an indelicate way of putting it, but I think
it's good.
Yeah, having that familiarity and that competence gives you the conviction, which then can steady your hand. And you might be, there is ambiguity, and then there's a complete black hole of I don't know what's happening.
Yeah.
And navigating those two is not the same thing. Let's in the time that we have, let's talk about CPG. We've sort of nibbled around the edges here. So as I discussed with you when we met earlier this year, Scott, we mostly talk to traditional agribusiness leaders and not as much to the final shelf-ready food manufacturing leg of the supply chain. Occasionally we do, but it's more infrequent. Now, I think though there's more and more over time with some of our listeners and some of the client organizations we work with, there's a temptation to vertically integrate to those higher value added activities and potentially even position yourself in the supply chain, to get right in front of the customer, as it will. It's where a lot of margin exists relative to commodities. I don't know if CPG has the margins of selling NVIDIA chips, but so there's always this temptation. So I think as folks look at where do we want to grow into our supply chains, CPG is always something that's either far on the horizon or maybe coming into focus for them. And so with that, what would you share about your journey and lessons so far, speaking specifically to folks that are maybe in that origination, logistics, distribution, processing, or trading aspect, and they're thinking about, hey, could we use some of the products we handle to create a CPG product to own that channel and grab some of those seemingly juicy margins? What would you say to those folks that you've learned along the way?
Well, I mean, I could say a lot, but try to be, first of all, don't just chase the margin because it'll go away. It'll be there's a margin there for a reason. Maybe it's because of it's high barrier entry, or there's really a lot of cost to get through that margin. And those two things, either one of them will take a lot of time, if not years and years to understand. And so don't just chase the margin. If you have a conviction about why you're doing it, and it's because you have a conviction, and then there's margin, is when it gets tough, you'll continue to go, even when there's a conviction. That's number one. Number two, if you're in the commodity world and you make a sale or a purchase to someone, you have a contract, guess what? It's going to get delivered. The lady who helped me start Verse Chocolate, she was listening to me one day as KSW was going, and I made a sale of cocoa butter to somebody, and she overheard that conversation, and I sold 100 tons worth of cocoa butter, and maybe that was like, I don't know what it was at the time, $400,000 sale. And she's like, I get off the phone and she goes, how do you know they're going to take that? I go, what do you mean? She goes, how do you know they're going to take that product? I go, well, we have a contract, and of course they're going to take it. What do you mean, how do they know they're going to take it? We have a contract. And she goes, and I was just starting off on this, and she was helping me get started. She goes, we don't have that in my world. I go, what do you mean? She goes, there is no contract like with Walmart or Whole Foods. There is no contract where they're going to take what you're making. They may say, yeah, we'll take it. But if they decide not to take it anymore, guess what? They just stop taking it. Because if the consumer's not picking it up off the shelf, they'll kick you out because they want to put somebody else there, so a consumer will pick that product off the shelf. And that, I should have heeded that warning. Frankly, looking back 7 years ago, that is such a vast difference from if you're in the supply chain world, what you're used to. And, there is no contract with Walmart. There is no contract with Whole Foods saying, I'm going to take that product. If you own the brand, now there may be if you're doing a private label for them, but if you own the brand, and so you are taking the risk of putting, and then you have to go create the demand for somebody to come and pick that up off the shelf. And think about that. How do you do that? And that's for marketing. I didn't know any of these things. I got an agribusiness degree from Southern Illinois University. I didn't take the marketing class. And I'm like, well, I have to do what? You got to go create the demand. And you're like, so you're supplying, but you got to go create the demand of your own product. Like, who does that? Nobody goes and creates the demand of their own product.
You don't own the channel. You don't sit in front of the customer at the point of sale, but you have to create the demand for someone to actually want it. And then the person that's going to sit in the middle doesn't have to commit to the volume that you produce.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's kind of crazy.
Yeah. Is it also risk reverse that let's say you've only produced X thousand cases of XYZ product for Walmart because you don't want to overproduce relative to what before you have some signal that they are likely going to be interested in having this on more stores and more shelves. And what if you underproduce what their eventual demand is? Can that also damage the relationship whereby you miss the opportunity because you're not prepared for the volume that they want?
Well, okay, so I use Walmart as an example because we can all relate. We don't do any business right now with Walmart. That's not our target. But we do business with Whole Foods, and I can only assume that Walmart would be similar to others. But I will use Whole Foods as an example. In fact, we got close to running out of a product. And what happens if you run out of a product? I mean, there's shelf space. It's it's real estate value. They're going to put something there. And if you can't put your product on the shelf, even though you've been approved, and something else goes there, there's a good chance you won't get back on that shelf. So yeah, if you ran out, it's a risk the other way. If you run out, if you can't put your product on the shelf, you run the risk that you may not get back on there. And that's a real thing.
Interesting. This is not a dynamic that I was familiar with. I've heard, of course, with, stocking fees, the negotiation on placement of product and getting sort of choice shelf placements, the coveted end caps, right? And all that.
You just pay for it. If you want that, if they'll let you, if they think your product's good enough, you got to pay a lot of money to get it on an income.
What have you learned on the demand creation side, Scott? So outside of the channel and distribution, actually carving out a position for your brand, articulating the value proposition and why you're different. And then how do you I guess maybe outside of sales via Whole Foods, how do you know if the demand's actually getting traction?
You see the sales pick up, but like in our product, the way you got to get people to taste it. There's lots of chocolates out there, and when they see our chocolate is a 70 or 90%, they immediately think dark, and they immediately think bitter.
Yeah,
and only 28% of the United States population will eat dark chocolate, and that includes like a dark, like Hershey Dark or a Dove, the Mars Dove chocolate, which is more like 50%. So ours is going to be. So people are already kind of scared of it. So you got to get them to taste it. So you got to in price. You got to have it priced right. You got to get them to taste. So you do tastings. You go to the stores. You go to the highest volume stores. You get them to taste it, and then you put it on sale. So those are the things, and you see how it creates. But what's interesting, we also have seen that online on e-commerce, there's a similar, it's pricing, but then of course they're not tasting it, but it has to look attractive online, and you got to hit the right keywords. You got to do all these things and I've spent, people say it's easy. We hired 75 influencers 5 years ago. I paid $17,000 and some dollars for 75 influencers on Instagram to talk about our product. I didn't sell $1 worth of product. Nobody cared about our product on Instagram 5 years ago. And now though, like on Walmart.com or Amazon.com or even directly at versechocolate.com, people will find us because they're searching for dark chocolate, or they're searching for low sugar or keto or, diabetes. That's where, some specific, but then they'll find it and they'll like the keywords like, oh, I'm going to try this. And then our repeat customers start to happen. And so like we've seen just like in the month of November, like at Whole Foods this year. So we've created demand through price, through doing trial at Whole Foods on site. And then we changed the package to make it look attractive. Those three things have led to, like, just at Whole Foods, we're up. I just looked at it right before we got on. 83.4% we're up year on year, just at Whole Foods. And then on e-com, we're up for the month of November. We're up last year, November, over 600%. Just by changing, but I didn't know these. I still don't know these things. I had to hire people. I had to bring people on who knew these things to help me understand what I don't know. And that's where you start to realize I just don't know. I can learn so much, but can't learn everything. So then you start to realize, you start calling out, okay, I really don't know anything about this. I can learn it, or I can go find somebody who knows it. And then I got to figure, can I trust them? And so then you got to.
And back to trust and confidence where we started. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it is. That's it. Business is all about relationships. I just still believe about relationships. You like the people you work with. Can you trust them? And if you can't, you better get that figured out quick. And, and is that a character issue or on your side or their side? And you admit to your own. And if they don't need to be on your team anymore.
Yeah. Well, we're going to leave it there in interest of time. Scott, we'll have links to Verse Chocolate and KSW and to yourself. So for folks that want to build upon this conversation with sampling the product, but I just want to, I enjoy talking to you. Nice. I like your energy and passion for the subject. I think there's also a degree of transparency in talking about your experiences, what you know and don't know. And I admire that. And I just want to say thank you for taking the time today to join us. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Joe. I appreciate your interest. I know this isn't what pretty much everybody eats chocolate at some point in time in their life. So maybe they're interested in it. So I think, but I appreciate you, and I like your questions and the articulation that you've brought to this. So thank you for that.
You bet. Wonderful conversation. I look forward to staying in touch. And to our listeners, I appreciate you also for being part of the Pacesetter Pod community and taking the time to listen and consider and then ultimately action different ways to improve strategy execution in support of growing your agribusiness. I never take your time for granted. I thank you for your support, and I look forward to having you join us next time right here on the Pacesetter Pod.
This is the podcastfactory.com.